The Galactic Council fell into panic after humanity rejected their offer. The air inside the conclave chamber smelled like nothing I had ever breathed before, not unpleasant, not pleasant either, just utterly alien. It carried a faint electrical trace, the way the atmosphere near a lightning strike does, except this was constant, as if the entire station existed in a permanent state of barely contained power. I noticed it the moment the airlock cycled shut behind me and my aide, Owen Garrett, who was 26 years old, brilliant with languages, and trying very hard not to look impressed. I was not trying at all, I was already impressed. There was no dignity in pretending otherwise. The conclave station hung in orbit above a gas giant the Council called Varanthos. It was roughly the size of a small moon. Its outer shell was layered in a pale alloy that absorbed light rather than reflected it, so the station looked like a hole cut in space rather than an object inside it. Our shuttle had approached it for 40 minutes before we even confirmed it had a surface. I had spent those 40 minutes reviewing my briefing files for the last time, though I already knew every word in them. Reading them again was just something to do with my hands. My name is Eli Voss. At the time of these events I was 44 years old, a commander in the United Earth Authority Diplomatic Division, and the first human being ever invited aboard a Galactic Council installation. The invitation had arrived 6 weeks earlier, delivered not through any of the radio channels humanity had used to signal other civilizations for 2 centuries, but through a courier vessel that appeared inside our solar system without warning, without any prior communication, and without any visible method of propulsion. It parked itself just beyond the orbit of Mars and broadcast a single repeating message on every frequency we monitored. The message said, "The Council requires the presence of Earth's designated representative at the conclave station above. Varanthos, transportation will be provided. Attendance is expected, not requested, expected." Our government had spent 3 weeks arguing about whether to go. I had spent those 3 weeks packing one bag and waiting. They sent me because I was the best available option, which was a polite way of saying I was the only diplomat with enough field experience, enough language training, and enough psychological stability to walk into an alien council chamber and not either freeze up or say something catastrophically wrong. At least that was the official reasoning. The unofficial reasoning, which my director had shared with me over a very bad cup of coffee the night before my departure, was simpler. She had said, "We need someone who can read a room that has never had a human being in it." The conclave chamber was enormous. I had expected that. What I had not expected was that it was shaped like the inside of a shell, curving upward and inward in a spiral that drew the eye naturally toward the center dais, where a single figure stood waiting. The seating tiers rose around the outer walls in concentric rings, and every seat was occupied. I estimated approximately 200 delegates. The species represented ranged from vaguely humanoid to entirely unlike anything in our biology files. Some communicated through bioluminescent patterns on their skin. Some through subsonic vibrations I felt in my chest rather than heard. Most sat in arrangements that suggested their physiology required a different geometry than ours to be comfortable. Owen whispered beside me, "There are species here we don't have names for yet." I said, "Write them down later." The figure on the central dais was the one I had been briefed on. Council Chair Vane Orath belonged to a species called the Quorum, who were ancient in the way mountains are ancient. Vane Orath had held the position of chair for what our historians calculated as roughly 900 Earth years. When I looked at the chair I felt, for the first time in my professional life, the very specific sensation of being genuinely small, not physically, existentially. I walked forward anyway. The translation system embedded in the chamber walls handled language without any noticeable lag, which was itself a feat of engineering that I suspected would take humanity another 50 years to replicate. When the chair spoke, the words arrived in my ears as clean, unaccented English, with none of the mechanical flatness of automated translation. It was almost unsettling how natural it sounded. The chair said, "Commander Voss, you have traveled far." I said, "Thank you for the transport." It was efficient. A ripple of something moved through the chamber, not quite sound, more like a change's pressure. I understood, from my briefing on conclave customs, that this was the equivalent of a room full of people exchanging glances. The chair studied me for a long moment with 3 pale eyes arranged in a triangle above a very thin mouth. Then it said, "You are not afraid." I said, "I am. I am simply not letting it make decisions for me." Another ripple through the room, longer this time. Over the next 3 hours, I was escorted through what the council called the orientation of welcome, which was a formal ceremony designed, as far as I could tell, to impress new arrivals with the scale and history of the Galactic Council's achievements. We were shown images of civilizations that had flourished under Council guidance. We were told of species that had nearly destroyed themselves before the Council intervened. We were given detailed accounts of the prosperity enjoyed by the 47-member civilizations currently under Council protection. Every single part of it was designed to make the same point. The Council was powerful, ancient, wise, and generous. Joining them was not a choice so much as a natural conclusion that any rational civilization would eventually reach. I listened carefully. I asked polite questions. Owen took notes that filled 3 handwritten pages. When it was done, the chair delivered the offer. I was given a document, physically delivered, which surprised me. It was a thin panel of material I could not identify, and the text on it shifted and reorganized as I tilted it, like the information was alive inside the surface. The chair explained that it was a summary of the Accord of Protected Status, the formal agreement by which new civilizations joined the Council family. The chair said, "We extend this to humanity with genuine warmth. You are a young species, but your potential has been noted. Under this accord, Earth will receive full protection from external threats, guidance in scientific development, and access to resources that your civilization could not reach independently for several centuries." I turned the panel over in my hands. I said, "And in exchange?" The chair did not pause. "Earth will operate within the Council's strategic framework for interstellar affairs. Your military development will be coordinated with Council oversight. Colonization efforts will be approved through the standard application process, and naturally, independent research into faster-than-light propulsion will be suspended until Earth reaches the appropriate tier of membership." I said, "How long does that take?" "Reaching the appropriate tier," the chair said. "For most species, between 300 and 500 years." I kept my expression completely still. I had practiced that expression in a mirror for a week before leaving Earth. I said, "I will need 72 hours to consult with my government." The silence that followed lasted almost 10 seconds. In a room that had not been quiet since I entered it, 10 seconds felt like a long time. The chair said, "Commander Voss, this offer is not one that typically requires deliberation." I said, "Most things worth deliberating over are not typical." They gave me the 72 hours. I could tell, from the way the chamber sounds changed as Owen and I were escorted to our quarters, that this concession was already being discussed at every tier of the room. That night I sat in the quarters they had given me, which were comfortable and carefully designed to approximate a human living space, down to a chair that was almost but not quite right, and I read the full text of the accord, not the summary. The full text, which Owen had spent 4 hours translating from the original Council script, using a program our linguistics division had built over 15 years. I read it twice. Then I set it down on the almost right chair and looked out the viewport at the gas giant below, which was a slow, enormous storm of amber and gray, and I thought about what the document actually said beneath all its gracious language. It said, "Become ours, quietly, for a very long time, and perhaps, eventually, we will let you become something slightly more." I thought about every human being who had ever pushed against a boundary they were told was fixed. Every scientist who had been laughed at before being proven right. Every generation that had been told to wait its turn and had decided not to. I already knew the answer. I had known it before I boarded the shuttle. I just needed to make sure Earth heard my reasoning before I said it out loud. In that enormous chamber, I sent the full text home, with my analysis attached, and I slept better than I had any right to. When I walked back into the conclave chamber 72 hours later, Owen walked beside me. He had not slept much. I could see it in the careful way he was holding himself together. He was 26, and he understood exactly what was about to happen, and to his enormous credit, he walked in with his head level and his notes tucked under his arm, like he was heading into a routine meeting. I had told him the night before what Earth's government had decided. He had gone very quiet for a moment, then nodded once and said, "All right, that was it." I had never respected anyone more for 2 syllables. The chamber was full again. I suspected it had never truly emptied. Word had spread through the station that the human delegation had taken the full 72 hours, which was, according to Owen's research into Council records, something that had never happened in the 4,000 years the accord had been offered to incoming civilizations. Most species had signed within hours. Several had signed before the ceremony was formally complete, from sheer eagerness. We had used every minute we were given. Chair Vanorith stood at the central dais in the same position as before. I had begun to wonder if the chair ever sat down or simply occupied that point in space as a permanent feature of the room. The formal protocols required me to approach the dais, receive the accord panel again, and either affix Earth's seal to it or return it unsigned. The seal was a small device our government had sent with me, encoded with Earth's official authorization signal. I carried it in my jacket pocket. I had been carrying it the entire time and had not touched it once. I took my position on the floor of the chamber, where a circular marking indicated where the representative of a prospective member species was expected to stand. The marking was inlaid into the floor in a material that glowed faintly, and I noticed it was positioned at the exact center of the spiral shell geometry of the room, so that every single seat in the chamber had a clear line of sight to whoever stood there. The chair asked me to state the decision of the United Earth Authority. I said, "Earth declines the Accord of Protected Status." The silence that followed was not like the previous silences. The previous silences had been the kind that happen when a room is surprised, momentary, a breath held and then released. This silence was the kind that happens when something breaks. It lasted nearly 30 seconds, I counted. Owen told me afterward that he had counted too and he got 31, but we agreed either number was extraordinary. Then the room began to produce sound again, and the sound was not organized. It was not discussion or debate. It was the simultaneous, unfiltered reaction of 200 alien delegates who had just heard something that their entire experience had told them was not possible. Different species expressed that reaction differently. Some made sounds, some changed color, some moved in ways that the geometry of their bodies made alarming, even though I understood, intellectually, that they were not threatening. One delegate from a species called the Pelori, which communicated through rapid chromatic shifts across a wide fan-like structure along its back, produced a display I had no reference for. Owen whispered to me that he believed it was the rough equivalent of a person dropping everything they were holding. The chair raised one long arm and the room settled, slowly, like water after a stone. The chair said, and even through the translation system I could hear something underneath the words that had not been there before. Something that was trying very hard to sound calm. "Commander Voss, perhaps the translation system has produced an error. Will you restate Earth's position?" I said, "There is no error. The United Earth Authority formally and respectfully declines the Accord of Protected Status. We thank the Council for the invitation and for the hospitality shown during our visit. Earth is not at this time prepared to enter into the terms described in the Accord." The chair said, "You are declining protection," I said. "We are declining the specific arrangement being offered. Those are different things," the chair said. "Commander, you understand that civilizations which have declined this accord have historically found themselves without recourse when facing threats they could not manage independently." I said, "I understand what you are describing. I want to be precise about something. Are you telling us that threat exists independently of the Council? Or are you describing a consequence of declining your offer?" The chamber went quiet again. Not the broken quiet of before. This was a more focused quiet, the kind that happens when a question cuts in a direction no one expected. The chair said, "The galaxy is a complex environment. The Council's protection is meaningful," I said. "I am sure it is, and I mean no disrespect to the Council or to the 47 member civilizations represented here, but Earth has reviewed the full text of the Accord, not only the summary, and we have found several provisions that we are not able to accept." A delegate near the back of the second tier spoke. The translation arrived in my ear as a voice that sounded like wind through metal. "Which provisions?" I said. "The suspension of independent research into faster-than-light propulsion. The requirement that military development be placed under external oversight. The colonization approval process, which our analysis suggests, would effectively prevent Earth from establishing mental intelligence for a minimum of 2 centuries. And the tier advancement timeline, which places full membership at a minimum of 300 years from today." A different delegate said, "These provisions exist to protect younger civilizations from their own instabilities." I said, "I understand that reasoning, but from where I stand, those provisions do not look like protection. They'd look like a ceiling with very comfortable furniture underneath it." Owen told me later that he had to physically stop himself from making any sound at that moment. I appreciated his discipline. The chair said, "Commander Voss, you are speaking on behalf of a species that has existed in spacefaring form for less than 100 years. The Council has guided civilizations for 60,000 years. We are offering you the accumulated benefit of that experience," I said, "and we are grateful for the offer. Genuinely. But humanity has a complicated history with arrangements where the party with more power decides what is best for the party with less, and that history has taught us to be very careful about what we sign." The chamber was not quiet now. It was producing a low, continuous sound that felt like a building frequency, as if the room itself was under pressure. Delegates were communicating with each other through whatever channels their species used. I could see it everywhere around me. Colors shifting, vibrations I felt through the floor, bioluminescent patterns firing rapidly. A delegate I had not heard from yet spoke from the highest tier. The translation arrived in a voice that was entirely flat, without inflection of any kind, which I understood from my briefing meant the species used tone not for emotion but for mathematical precision. It said, "The civilizations that have declined the Accord number 3. All 3 no longer exist as independent entities." I let that statement finish, and then I let the silence hold for a moment before I responded. I said, "I appreciate you saying that directly. I want to respond directly in return. If the Council is suggesting that declining this offer carries a specific consequence that the Council controls, then this conversation has become a different kind of conversation entirely. And if that is the kind of conversation we are having, then I would like to note that this chamber contains 200 delegates, and that everything said here is being recorded by my government's equipment, and by, I suspect, quite a few of yours." No one said anything, I said. If it is not that kind of conversation, then I accept the information as a historical note, and I wish those 3 civilizations well, wherever they went. The chair looked at me for a long time. I looked back. Then the chair said very quietly, "You are dismissed, Commander. We will communicate with Earth through formal channels." I said, "Thank you, Chair Orath. We look forward to continuing as good neighbors." I turned and walked toward the exit. Owen fell into step beside me exactly half a second later. I could hear the chamber behind us building in volume as delegates broke into open communication with each other. I did not look back. The corridor outside was long and pale and empty. Our escort was waiting to take us to the shuttle bay. We walked in silence for about 2 minutes before Owen spoke. He said, "They are going to take a while to process that." I said, "Good. Gives us time to get home." He said, "Are you afraid?" I thought about it honestly. I said yes, but I would have been more afraid if we had said yes. He nodded. We kept walking. The shuttle bay smelled like nothing. Clean vacuum-processed air with no electrical trace at all. It was, I realized, the first familiar smell I had encountered since boarding the station. I found it deeply comforting. We lifted off from the conclave station and watched it shrink behind us, a dark hole in a sky full of stars, and I began composing my report to the director with one thought repeated in every section, phrased in different ways, because I wanted her to understand it completely. We had just done something that no species in 4,000 years of recorded galactic history had done. We had said no, and we were still here. 3 days after Owen and I returned to Earth's orbital relay station, the communication started. Not from the Council, not officially. The official silence from the conclave was total and immediate, which was itself a kind of message. No formal protests, no follow-up negotiations, no carefully worded letters through diplomatic channels, just nothing, which in galactic politics meant something was happening that they did not want on record. The communications that did come were unofficial, quiet, and arrived through channels that technically did not exist. The first one came from a species called the Venthari, who were a Tier 2 Council member, which meant they had been under the Accord, long enough to have some internal autonomy, but not long enough to hold a voting seat in full Council sessions. The message was brief and used 3 different encryption layers that Owen spent most of a morning breaking. When he finally got through to the content, he read it twice, then handed the device to me without saying anything. The message said, "We observed the session. We would like to speak privately. We have questions about how you reached your decision. We do not wish to be identified." I read it once and wrote back a single line, "We are available." The second communication arrived 6 hours later from a species we did not have a name for in our records, which meant they were either very obscure within council structures or very careful about being obscured. Their message was longer and more cautious, wrapped in careful language that said very little while implying quite a lot. Reading between every line, the meaning was the same as the Ventharis. They had been watching. They had questions. By the end of the first week, we had received 7 such messages. By the end of the second week, 11. Owen began cataloging them by species, by council tier, and by the specific language patterns used. Because language patterns told you things about how afraid someone was when they wrote something. He told me one evening, over the cold tea we had both forgotten to drink while working. Several of these are from Tier 3 species. One might be from a Tier 2. The encryption on that one is significantly more sophisticated than the others. I said, "What does that tell you?" He said, It tells me that the higher up the council structure a species sits, the more careful they have to be about expressing curiosity, which means the curiosity is still there. They are just very practiced at hiding it. I thought about that for a while. Meanwhile, the council's public communications to Earth shifted in a way that was subtle enough that most people would not notice it. But I noticed it because I had spent 20 years learning to read the spaces between what people said and what they meant. Their transmissions became slightly more formal. The usual cultural exchange signals that had been running between Earth and Council monitoring stations for 50 years began to arrive with longer gaps between them. A trade inquiry that had been an informal negotiation for 3 months simply stopped receiving responses. None of it was a declaration of anything. All of it was pressure, applied slowly the way water shapes stone. You could not point to any single action and call it a threat. You could only feel the cumulative weight of it. Our government convened an emergency session. I attended via secure link from the relay station, my face on a screen in a room full of people who were afraid in the very specific way that's serious. Intelligent people are afraid when they realize they cannot fully calculate the risk they are facing. The director said, "Voss, what is your assessment of the council's immediate intent?" I said. "They are trying to determine whether we will flinch." She said, "Will we?" I said, "That depends on what happens next." What happened next was the embargo. The council announced it officially, through the formal broadcast channels that all recognized species used for interstellar public communication. It was short. It stated that Earth had declined integration into the Council's cooperative framework, and that, as a result, Earth would not receive access to Council-mediated trade networks, resource-sharing agreements, or technological exchange programs until such time as Earth's government reconsidered its position. On the surface, this sounded serious. In practice, humanity had been almost entirely outside those networks anyway, because we had only been a spacefaring species for 90 years, and had not yet established meaningful trade with any council members. The embargo was designed to feel like being locked out of a building. The problem was that we had never had a key to begin with. Our economic analysts ran the numbers in about 4 hours and reported that the material impact on Earth's economy was close to zero. The response from Earth's population, when the embargo was announced on public news channels, was roughly what I had expected from a species that had been through everything humans had been through. About 40% of people were worried. About 30% were angry. About 20% found the whole situation darkly amusing. And about 10% immediately started designing merchandise. I saw a shirt within 48 hours that read, "The council said no thanks. We said it first." I bought one. It seemed important to document the moment correctly. Meanwhile, the more significant development was happening quietly, at a level below the public announcements and political statements. Earth's military and scientific divisions had been operating under a long-standing policy of cautious restraint with regard to faster-than-light research and deep space defense infrastructure, partly because we were still developing the underlying technologies, and partly because there had always been a persistent diplomatic argument that progressing too aggressively might alarm the Council before we had a relationship established. That argument no longer applied. Within 10 days of our return, the UEA Strategic Council authorized 3 previously delayed research initiatives. The first was the completion of a deep space early warning network that would give Earth approximately 90 minutes of advance notice for any large object approaching from beyond the outer system. The second was the full funding and acceleration of the Sabre propulsion project, which was our leading research effort toward practical faster-than-light travel. The third was the activation of 11 orbital defense platforms that had been built, tested, and then placed in standby mode while diplomacy was ongoing. None of this was secret. We broadcast the activation announcements on the same public channels the Council used. I was sitting in the relay station's small observation deck when the first Council warship appeared. Owen was with me. We both saw it at the same moment on the sensor display. He said nothing, I said nothing. We just looked at it. It was large. Not the largest class the Council operated, based on our limited intelligence files, but large enough that its presence in the outer solar system was impossible to misread. It positioned itself just past the orbit of Neptune and stayed there. It did not transmit. It did not move. It just existed at the edge of our sensor range, a fact placed deliberately in our field of vision. A message without words. I sent a report to the director. She responded within the hour. The response was 4 words. "What do you recommend?" I thought about it for a long time. Then I said finish the grid. She did. Over the next 6 days, the 11 orbital defense platforms came fully online. The early warning network activated. Construction crews that had been working on 3 additional platforms ahead of schedule were authorized to complete them. Earth did not announce any of this loudly or with aggressive language. We simply did it, and the sensor records made it visible to anyone watching, which the Council very certainly was. On the 8th day, the warship was still there. On the 9th day, I received a private communication from Chair Vane Orath. It did not come through any official diplomatic channel. It came through a frequency that was technically reserved for emergency distress signals, which told me several things about the chair's state of mind. The message itself was short. It said, "Commander Voss, you have miscalculated. Earth is alone. Consider carefully what that means." I read it 3 times. I thought about the 7 quiet messages from other species asking how we had made our decision. I thought about the Venthari and their careful encryption layers. I thought about the Tier 2 species with the sophisticated encoding, who still had not identified themselves. Then I wrote back. I said, "Chair Orath, I appreciate you reaching out directly. I want to be honest with you, because I think honesty between us is more useful than formality at this point. Earth does not feel alone. We feel unencumbered. We understand that there are risks in the path we have chosen. We accept them. We have spent our entire history accepting risks, and it has made us very practiced at navigating them. I also want you to know that we have not forgotten the offer. We are not dismissing the Council or its members. We are simply asking to find a different way of being neighbors, one that does not require us to stop becoming what we are still in the middle of becoming." And then I added, "Because I believed it and because I thought it was worth saying. If that is a miscalculation, then at least it is ours to make." I signed it with my name and my title and Earth's official diplomatic seal, and I sent it. 2 days later, the warship left. The Council's intelligence assessment of Earth arrived in a strange way. They published it. I do not think they intended to publish it, based on the sequence of events that followed, and the frantic official retraction that came approximately 9 hours after the document appeared on the Public Interstellar Communication Network. I believe it was released by someone inside the Council structure who wanted it seen, but I had no proof of that. I only had the document itself, which spread across every listening post and relay station and research network in known space within about 6 hours. The way information always spreads when it is the kind of information people have been waiting for. The assessment was called, in the Council's formal language, a strategic evaluation of the human anomaly. They called us an anomaly. I saved that particular page and sent a copy to the director with a note that said simply, "They named us correctly at least." The document was thorough. I gave them that. Their intelligence apparatus had been observing Earth for longer than we had known about them, and the data they had accumulated was detailed and in many places accurate. They knew our military capacity, our resource production, our population figures, our primary political structures. They had analyzed our historical patterns of conflict and cooperation. They had modeled our decision-making processes and built probability trees around our likely responses to various pressures. Their projection for Earth's survival as an independent civilization, given our refusal of the Accord and the subsequent economic and diplomatic pressure being applied, was 40% at 10 years and 11% at 50 years. The probability they assigned to Earth successfully developing faster-than-light propulsion, without Council assistance, was listed as effectively 0. They gave us no probability at all for the scenario in which we formed meaningful alliances with other Council-adjacent species, because their models had apparently not included that as a variable worth calculating. Owen read that last part twice and then said, very quietly, "They did not think we could make friends." I said no. They thought they controlled all the introductions, 11% at 50 years. I read that figure several times. I was not going to pretend it did not sit in my chest with some weight. 11% was not nothing. It was also not a number anyone could feel comfortable about. But the document was meant to frighten us into reconsidering. And the thing about using a document to frighten someone is that you have to consider whether the document might do other things once it is out in the world. Earth's scientific community went through the assessment like a flood goes through a city. Not destructively, rapidly, thoroughly, and with the specific energy of people who have been underestimated in writing and now have proof of it. Within 48 hours, Earth's chief propulsion research team published a public response. It was not a political document, it was a scientific one. It went through the Council's assessment of our faster-than-light research section by section, and it did not argue emotionally or rhetorically. It simply showed its work. Updated figures, revised timelines, experimental results that had not been in the Council's data because they were too recent. The response concluded with a single paragraph that was not scientific at all. The lead researcher on the Sabre project, a woman named Clara Odom, who had been working on the propulsion problem for 19 years, and who was known among her colleagues for being almost impossible to excite about anything, had apparently written it herself in about 3 minutes and refused to let anyone edit it. It said, "The Council's assessment places successful faster-than-light propulsion beyond Earth's independent reach. We respectfully suggest they update their models." The Sabre project's latest test had achieved 0.6 light speed in a controlled environment. The target was 0.95. The team's internal timeline for reaching that target had just been revised from 4 years to 14 months. That paragraph went everywhere. Fast, I was called back to the conclave station, not with ceremony this time, not with the formal orientation of welcome, or the carefully designed quarters meant to approximate human comfort. I was summoned through an official channel in plain language that said simply, "The Council request Commander Voss's presence at the conclave station at his earliest convenience." At his earliest convenience. Not expected. Requested. Owen noticed the change in phrasing immediately. He said, "That is different from last time." I said, "Yes." He said, "Is that good?" I said, "I do not know yet, but it is different, and different is somewhere to start." I arrived at the conclave station 12 days after the summons. This time, when the airlock cycled open, there was no formal escort waiting. There was, instead, a small crowd of delegates from various species who had apparently positioned themselves near the arrival bay and were observing my entry with the kind of focused attention that is very hard to mistake for anything casual. I walked through them without stopping. I nodded at the ones who made eye contact. Several nodded back. When I reached the corridor that led to the main diplomatic wing, a figure stepped out from a side passage and fell into step beside me. I recognized the species as Venthari from the markings on the shoulder. Structures. This individual was not anyone I had formally met, but they spoke without preamble, in a quiet voice that the translation system rendered as something close to a whisper. They said, "Commander Voss, you received our message." I said, "I did," they said. "We have more questions now than when we sent it." I said, "So do I, perhaps we can answer each other's." They walked with me for another 30 seconds in silence. Then they said, "There are others, more than you have heard from. They are waiting to see what happens in this session before they decide whether to reach out." I said, "Tell them that reaching out has not done us any harm yet." The Venthari delegate made a sound I did not have a translation for, but which felt, in some way I could not fully explain, like the sound of someone exhaling after holding their breath for a very long time. Then they peeled away into a side corridor and I continued forward alone. The chamber was different this time, not in its structure, in its atmosphere. The spiral shell geometry was unchanged, the tiered seating still full, the central dais still illuminated. But the sound of the room was different. The previous sessions had felt like a room watching a performance. This one felt like a room that did not know what it was about to watch. Chair Orith stood at the dais. I took my position at the circular marking on the floor. The chair said, "Commander Voss, thank you for returning," I said. "Of course," the chair said. "The Council has reviewed Earth's recent statements and activities. There are members of this body who wish to understand your government's intentions more clearly." I said, "I am happy to explain them." A delegate from the third tier said, "Your propulsion research has accelerated significantly. This was not projected," I said. "When you told us it could not be done, it turned out to be very motivating." The pressure change ripple moved through the room again, longer than before. A different delegate said, "You are not afraid of us." That is not accurate. We take the Council's power and experience very seriously. But there is a difference between respect and the particular kind of fear that makes you sign things you should not sign, the chair said, and yet you stand in this chamber without allies, without the protection the Accord would have given you, without membership in any of the frameworks that structure civilized space. I looked around the room. I looked at the Venthari section. I looked at several other delegations that I was beginning to connect to the quiet messages that had been arriving over the past weeks. I said, "Chair Orith, with respect, I am not sure that last part is entirely accurate." The room did not produce a ripple that time. It produced something closer to stillness. The kind of stillness that happens when a room suddenly understands that the conversation they thought they were in is actually a different conversation entirely. I kept my face calm. My heart was doing what hearts do when the largest thing you have ever tried to accomplish suddenly feels like it might actually be possible. I said, "I think Earth has more neighbors than either of us realized." The Sabre project broke through at month 11, 3 months ahead of the revised estimate. which itself had been 4 years ahead of the Council's projection. I was back on Earth when it happened, doing something as ordinary as reviewing diplomatic correspondence in my office at the UEA headquarters in Geneva, when Clara Odom's message arrived. It was not long. She was not a person who wrote long messages. It said simply, "We did it. Test 4 confirmed. Sustained faster than light travel. Full report to follow. Thought you should know first." I sat with that for a moment. Then I forwarded it to the director, the full cabinet, and the heads of the 6 research programs that had been working in parallel with the Sabre team. Then I walked to the window of my office and looked out at the city for a while. We had been told it was impossible without Council guidance. We had been told, in precise percentage terms, that we were unlikely to survive as an independent civilization long enough to develop it on our own. We had been told, politely but consistently, that we were a young species who did not fully understand the scale of what we were operating within. All of that was probably meant kindly. I even believed that some of it was. It was still wrong. The full report came through 6 hours later. I read every page of it, which took most of the night, and at the end I felt something I rarely allowed myself to feel in a professional context. Something that was not quite triumph, because triumph felt too sharp for what this was. It was more like the feeling of a long-held breath released. Clara Odom had been working on this problem since she was 23 years old. The team she had built included 61 researchers from 14 countries and 4 space stations. They had failed 412 times before Test 4 worked. 412 times they had rebuilt, recalculated, and started again. That was not a dramatic story. It was not a single heroic moment. It was something much more human than that. It was just people who refused to stop. The Council's response to the announcement was official silence, which by now I was beginning to read quite accurately. Official silence from the Council meant internal noise. What reached us through the back channels, the quiet messages, the careful communications from species who still did not put their names on things, was a picture of a conclave in real disruption. Not the public kind, where statements are made and positions are declared. The private kind, where very old assumptions are being examined for the first time in a very long time. And the examination is uncomfortable. One of those back-channel messages was different from the others. It came through the same emergency distress frequency that Chair Orath had used to contact me months earlier. This told me, before I even decrypted it, that it was significant. The message was not from the chair. It was from a delegate I had not heard from before, who identified themselves only as a member of the Council's internal oversight body, which was a structure I had not known existed. Their message was longer than most of what I had received, and it was written in the careful, precise language of someone who had spent a long time thinking about what they wanted to say. They said, in summary, that a significant faction within the Council had been arguing for weeks that Earth's situation needed to be reconsidered, that the original offer, the Accord of Protected Status, was the only framework the Council had for engaging with new civilizations, and that framework had been built on assumptions about how species behaved, and what they wanted that Earth was making extremely difficult to defend. They said that what Earth had done, by refusing publicly, by activating defenses rather than retreating, by accelerating research instead of slowing it, and most importantly by quietly gathering the attention of species throughout the Council who had their own unexpressed questions, had exposed a gap in the Council's model that several of its oldest members were finding very difficult to ignore. They said, "We built a system for bringing civilizations in. We do not have a system for a civilization that stands at the edge and makes others. Wonder what standing at the edge looks like." I read that twice. Then I sent a message to Owen, who was at his desk in the relay station. 3 hours behind me, in time zone terms, and almost certainly awake anyway, I said. "I need you to run updated contact lists for all the species who have reached out to us. Every one of them. I want to know how many there are now and what tier they sit at." He responded in 4 minutes. The list had grown to 23. I spent the next 3 days preparing the most careful document I had ever written. It was not a diplomatic brief in the traditional sense. It was more like a letter, addressed to no one specific, that described what Earth had been trying to say from the beginning. We were not rejecting the galaxy. We were not declaring ourselves enemies of the Council or its members. We were not even saying the Council's model was wrong for everyone. We were saying it was not right for us, and that we believed, based on evidence that was growing daily, that we might not be alone in that assessment. The letter said that Earth was open to a different kind of relationship, one built on genuine equality rather than tier structures and centuries-long probationary periods. one where sovereignty was not a privilege extended by the more powerful party, but a baseline assumed for everyone, one where the history of the galaxy could be written by more voices than the ones that had always held the pen. I sent it to every contact on Owen's list. 2 days later, I received a formal communication from Chair Vane Orath, not through an emergency frequency, not through a back channel, through the official diplomatic channel that the Conclave used for recognized interlocutors. It said, "Commander Voss, the Council requests a meeting at your earliest convenience. We wish to discuss a revised framework for Earth's engagement with the broader galactic community." Revised framework. I read those 2 words several times. Then I sent back a single message that said, "We will attend. We would also like to bring several guests, if that is acceptable." The response arrived in less than an hour. It said, "The Council welcomes all who wish to attend." Owen was standing beside me when I read that. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "They changed the word again." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Last time it was expected, then it was requested, now it is welcomes." I looked at him. He shrugged, but I could see he was trying not to smile. I said, "Write it down. That is the progression. That is what this whole thing has been." He wrote it down. The shuttle approached the Conclave station from a different angle than the first 2 times. Not by navigational necessity, by choice, because Owen had calculated that this approach would give us the longest possible unobstructed view of the station as we came in, and he thought I might want it. He was right. I watched it come into view through the forward viewport. Still dark against the stars, still absorbing light rather than reflecting it, still enormous in the way that things built by civilizations 60,000 years older than yours tend to be enormous. But it looked different to me now than it had the first time. Not smaller, just more like a place rather than a symbol. We were not alone on the shuttle. Behind me, filling the passenger section of a vessel that had been intended to carry 8 people comfortably, were representatives of 9 species. The Venthari had sent their most senior diplomat, a quiet individual named Aish, who communicated primarily in the chromatic language of their people, but had been working with an interpreter for weeks to be ready for this. A species called the Dreth Convocation had sent 3 representatives, which their culture required for any decision of significance, since they made all major choices through internal consensus. There were individuals from 4 other species, whose names I was still learning to pronounce correctly, and 1 representative from the Tier 2 species, who had sent the most carefully encrypted of all the early messages, and had only finally identified themselves to us 5 days before departure. Their name was Velum. They were from a species called the Etheri, who had been Tier 2 council members for approximately 300 years, and who had, according to their own private account, been quietly asking questions for most of that time. Velum sat directly behind me on the shuttle and had barely spoken during the journey. When I turned to check on the group about an hour before arrival, our eyes met, and Velum said, in a voice the translation system rendered as measured and very precise, "Commander Voss, do you believe this will work?" I said. "I believe it is necessary. Whether it works depends on a great many people making a great many choices correctly." Velum said. "That is not a comforting answer," I said. "No, but it is an honest one." Velum nodded, which was apparently a gesture with approximately the same meaning in Aetheri culture as in human culture, one of the small coincidences that made the universe feel slightly less enormous sometimes. The airlock cycled open, and we stepped into the conclave station, 9 humans and representatives of 9 other species, and the corridor beyond was not empty. Word had spread before our arrival. Of course it had. In a station full of species that communicated through methods ranging from radio signals to biological chemical releases, information moved in ways that made human gossip look slow. Delegates had positioned themselves in the corridor, not blocking it, but present, watching. I recognized some of them from the chamber sessions. I did not recognize most of them. I nodded as I walked. Some nodded back. One delegate from a species I could not immediately identify reached out one of 4 limbs in a gesture that I did not know but responded to, instinctively by touching their extended limb briefly with my hand. Owen told me afterward that in that species culture, it was a gesture of greeting between equals, not between a host and a guest, between equals. The chamber was the same. The spiral shell, the tiered seating, the central dais, the circular marking on the floor. Chair Vane Orath stood at the dais. I took my position at the marking. The 9 representatives who had traveled with me stood in a group slightly behind, and to my left, which was where Owen had suggested they stand based on his research into how council sessions were arranged when multiple parties were present. It was a small detail. It mattered because small details always matter. The chair looked at me, then deliberately looked at the group behind me, then returned to me. The chair said, Commander Voss, you have brought guests. I said, I have brought colleagues. The chair absorbed that. Then the chair said, the council has discussed Earth's situation at length. There are members of this body who believe the original framework we offered was appropriate and remains so. There are also members who believe that Earth's path since declining the Accord represents something that deserves a different kind of consideration. I said, I am glad to hear that, Chair Orith. The chair said, before I continue, I want to ask you something directly. When you declined the Accord, did you anticipate this outcome? I thought about that genuinely. I said, I anticipated that Earth would be pressured. I anticipated that some members of the Council might find our decision difficult to understand. I did not anticipate the exact form of what followed. No, what I anticipated was that we would remain ourselves through whatever followed, and that remaining ourselves would matter more than any particular outcome. The chair was quiet for a moment. Then the chair said, the Council wishes to propose a revised engagement with Earth. Not the Accord of Protected Status, something we have not offered before. A delegate from the second tier spoke. A Tier 1 consultation arrangement. Equal standing in all sessions where matters affecting Earth or Earth's interests are discussed. Full sovereignty retained. No timeline restrictions. No oversight provisions. Another delegate spoke. Colonization rights unencumbered. A third. Technological research conducted independently. I listened to each provision. I kept my face still and my breathing steady. Behind me, I could hear the faintest sounds of the 9 representatives absorbing the translation of what was being said. When they had finished listing the provisions, I said, the offer is significant. I am grateful. I want to be transparent about something. The chair waited. I said, Earth will not enter this arrangement alone. If we are to be part of a new framework for engagement with the galactic community, we believe it should be built alongside others who have had similar questions about the existing framework. We are not trying to dismantle what the Council has built. We respect its history and its achievements. But a table where new voices are genuinely equal to old ones is a stronger table for everyone. I turned slightly toward the group behind me. I said, these colleagues represent civilizations that have been part of the Council's community for years, in some cases centuries, and that have their own thoughts about how that community could evolve. We would like to begin those conversations here, today, together. The chamber was very quiet. Chair Orith looked at me for a long moment, then looked at the group behind me, then around the room, at the tiered seating, at the 200 delegates who had been watching this unfold. Then the chair said something I had not expected, in a voice that had lost the particular quality of absolute certainty it had carried in every previous session. The chair said, we had not predicted this, I said. No, I know. There was a pause, then the chair said, sit down, Commander Voss, all of you. Let us talk. There was no seat at the central dais. That space was only ever occupied by one figure standing. But a member of the chamber staff brought seating from somewhere and arranged it just beyond the circular marking. Seats designed for different physiologies, brought out with a speed that suggested they had been prepared, that someone had anticipated this, that maybe more than one person in the Council's long history had wondered what this moment might look like if it ever arrived. I sat down. Velum Rowe sat beside me. Aesh of the Venthari settled into the arrangement that worked for their physiology. The Dreth Convocation's 3 members arranged themselves in the triangle their culture required. The others found their places. Owen sat on my right and opened his notes. The session lasted 11 hours. I will not recount every exchange. Some of it was formal. Some of it was halting and difficult, because very old systems do not change easily, and the people who have operated within them for a long time sometimes need more than one conversation to see them differently. There were moments when I thought we had lost the thread, when a delegate said something that seemed to close a door. Then someone else opened it again. At no point did I raise my voice. At no point did Velum Rowe or Aesh or any of the 9. We had not come to win an argument. We had come to have a different kind of conversation than the Council was used to having. By the end of the 11th hour, there was no signed document. There was no formal agreement. What there was something that felt more durable than either of those things. A shared understanding that the conversation was not finished, and that everyone in the room intended to continue it. Before we rose to leave, the chair said, Commander Voss, I have a question that is not formal. I said, please. The chair said, when you first declined the Accord, and you walked out of this chamber, what were you thinking? I considered the honest answer. I said, I was thinking that the hardest part was already done, and that everything after that depended on whether we were willing to keep going. The chair said, Were you? I said. We are still here, Chair Orth. The chair looked at me for a long time with those 3 pale eyes. And then, for the first time in any session I had attended, the chair's very thin mouth moved in a way that I did not have an exact translation for. But that Owen, who had been watching every expression in the room all day, leaned over and whispered to me as we stood to leave. He said, I think that was a smile. I did not look back to check. I had learned, in the months since all of this began, that the moments worth keeping were not the ones you observed. They were the ones you walked forward from. The corridor outside was quieter than the first time I had walked it. The delegates who had gathered to watch our arrival were gone now, back to their work, their communications, their own long conversations about what today had meant. I walked out of the conclave station alongside 9 representatives of 9 other species, through air that smelled like electricity, and the careful possibility of something new. And I thought about all the times in human history that someone had stood at a line they were told they could not cross and had crossed it anyway. Not because they were certain of what was on the other side, but because standing still had stopped being an option. We had not crossed a line today. We had started drawing a different one. That was enough. That was in fact everything.